Welcome back to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. As this is what I like to think of as an academic podcast, every once in a while, like every few years, I think it is appropriate and even necessary to take a look at what's going on to our institutions that enable academic research. After all, pretty much everything that you're hearing on this podcast comes from people who work within those institutions and benefit from the arrangements that they have made to enable people to spend time doing research, which is not a natural thing for human beings to do. A few years ago, in an episode conversation with Tamar Hodos, we discussed the impact of what we might broadly call neoliberal priorities on the American Research University, and certainly not just the American University. That was actually more of a global discussion. That is, the decline in state funding and support meant that much of the cost was being shifted onto students and their parents, which was turning higher education into something more like an investment in their own future earnings and productivity, rather than something like an education and a public good. It was pretty clear, and in fact, the managerial style administrators that were taking over most of our universities were not making any secrets about it, that the goal was to push students away from the humanities, which were deemed fairly useless investment of time and energy, into more productive sectors of the economy, such as engineering and scientific research and medicine and things like that. Law, not sure it's productive, but it's certainly profitable. And of course, much of this was carried out, especially in the United States, in an ideological context that can be termed anti-government, which is the idea that government should not be doing much to support individuals or citizens, but that they should be taking their own personal responsibility for their own fates, including certainly their education. Now, what happens very often when these movements become radicalized is that when suddenly you have people in power who decide to take them, to their logical extreme or beyond, you end up with results that were not quite what all of that managerial class was expecting. And this is exactly the situation that we find ourselves in today with the second administration of Donald Trump, which, as you may have heard, has essentially paused most federal support for scientific research, and that includes all of those STEM fields that were supposed to be the future of America's best and brightest youths. This was not what we were being told as the rationale for austerity in the previous decade, but it is going to have tremendous and severe and in many ways unpredictable results and impacts on research. Now, the humanities actually depend on a lot less in terms of financial support. So cutting the National Endowment for the Humanities and its grants, which has happened, is not going to affect humanities research directly in the short term that much. But when universities are faced with billions of dollars of potential cuts in funding to scientific research, that is all the labs and engineering and medical schools and hospitals and so on, this is going to have an impact on their finances that will affect everything. We don't know exactly how and how much. Right now, things are still very much in flux. But insofar as the research that you hear about on this podcast or read in monographs and scholarly articles does depend on this institutional framework, it's going to be impacted, and probably sooner rather than later if this continues and we don't have some kind of reversion to previous funding practices. This is all very much what we might call an existential issue for our fields, our profession. The future of scholarship is very much on our minds. It is also a very uncertain moment. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. But I thought it would be appropriate to dedicate an episode to this, and I couldn't think of a better person with whom to discuss these developments than my colleague here at the University of Chicago, Clifford Ando. Cliff is an outstanding Roman historian, and I have learned so much from him over the decades from reading his scholarship and speaking with him. And there are so many other topics that I imagined that I would have him on the podcast to discuss. And, we had thrown some ideas around it. He's a very busy person. I don't want to take up his time with this. However, recently, Cliff has become very active in the matter of university finances. Certainly locally here at the University of Chicago, but more generally, what's going on with universities? What are their funding models? What are their vulnerabilities, their assets, revenues, responsibilities, and so on? I do hope one day to have Cliff on as a guest where we talk either about our research or Roman history or Roman law or whatever. But this is what our times have put before us right now, and this is what has preoccupied a lot of Cliff's attention, how universities should respond to this unprecedented crisis in which we are facing an active movement to dismantle whole sectors of the American government, including the funding structures that keep many of our research universities not only alive, but at the forefront of scholarship and scientific research in the world. And that's being jeopardized right now in a way that will do no one any good. Very quickly, Cliff sometimes refers to the main funding agencies in the United States by their acronyms. These are well known here. I understand they might not be that well known abroad. So the NSF is the National Science Foundation. The NIH is the National Institutes for Health, funding mostly medical research. The NEH is the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is tiny compared to the others. Cliff also refers at one point of our discussion to the ROTC. This is the Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is a program that allows cadets training for officer positions in the U.S. Army to be simultaneously carrying out their education at a university. And also and at one place only he refers to 501c3 institutions. That's just a designation for the tax-exempt status of, say, universities. Okay, these acronyms and abbreviations don't appear that much in our discussion. Don't be alarmed. But I thought I would mention them just in case. Okay, thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes on their website and also on YouTube. Let's get straight to my discussion with Cliff about the federal assault on American research universities. Hello, Cliff. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you for having me.
There are so many other occasions on which I have imagined having you on as a guest, but here we are on a topic that I had not expected we'd be talking about. But, we deal with the world that we live in, and these are the challenges that, you've risen to confront. So since we are at what seems to be a critical moment in the history of American universities, I thought it would be useful to explain to our audience what the financial context for university research is in the United States. And I think you would agree with me, or I agree with you, that American universities are among the best in the world at fostering both teaching and research. And it would be a real pity for them to suffer any more harm than they have. So, having said that, let's talk a little bit at first about the general framework of funding for American universities, especially research universities, whether private or public. Because in some countries, universities are funded directly by the state. They answer to the Ministry of Education. In Greece, at least, there are no private universities, at least none that do research. But American universities have a very peculiar, somewhat idiosyncratic funding structure, a very mixed one, right? Sort of diverse. So where do they get their money from primarily?
That's a great question, Anthony, and it's particularly valuable to think about. You're absolutely right in the context of other systems of education. And I suspect today we'll come back a couple of times to the idiosyncratic structure of both higher education and research in the United States. The diversity of authorities in the United States and the diversity of funding is a part of what makes American higher education so distinctive. Loosely speaking, American America's leading research universities, we might call them, as distinct from second-tier public universities, or for that matter, liberal arts colleges. The leading research universities get money from something like six different categories of money. They get money from students in the form of tuition. Um, they almost always in their financial statements will break out as a second category, something like the provision of auxiliary services, which essentially means dormitory rooms. But it's not a small figure at some universities. Um, they get grants and contracts for research, largely from the federal government, but sometimes also from state and local government, and of course, occasionally from private sponsors. They get direct federal aid for specific purposes that is not connected with research, including things like Pell Grants for students, GI Bill tuition grants. In the aftermath of during and after the COVID crisis, the federal government gave specific grants to universities to fund student mental health centers.
Hmm.
Um, and for the wealthier universities that have endowments, as we call them, that have received long-term gifts. Those gifts pay out money each year, and the big leading research universities all earn substantial money from endowment payout. You mentioned the distinction between public and private universities. The public universities in the United States are all regulated by and supported by the individual states. There is no public university of the United States. They're all state universities. And those state universities, as distinct from the private universities, receive money in the form of state appropriations, direct subsidies, almost always earmarked for education as opposed to research, but direct earmarks from their state governments. To give you some idea of the magnitude of these, let me just say that it might surprise people to know that at the University of Chicago, for example, tuition from all students combined pays for about 20% or accounts for about 20% of university revenue. Government grants and contracts for about another 20% of revenue, actually more like 18. Auxiliaries, dormitory rooms, food, and stuff like that brings in about 7%. Endowment payout accounts for about 16%, and so on. At large state universities, the numbers look slightly different. At the University of Michigan, tuition accounts for 32% of all revenue, with the auxiliary services kicking in another 8. State appropriations, despite the fact that the University of Michigan Ann Arbor is a state institution, state appropriations accounts for only 8%
Mm.
of the revenue of the university. Investment income or endowment payout accounts for about another 13%. And in that case, federal, state, and local grants combined account for about 25%. And when I speak about these, I'm talking for the moment strictly about the university and excluding their medical enterprises. We could come back to those if you wish, but I'll set them aside for now because they're in the larger state and university hospitals can sometimes earn patient revenue that dwarfs the entire revenue side of the university, and they change the
Right.
picture in some fundamental ways.
Right. To the degree that some universities invest in building hospitals precisely for that as a return. On So when people refer to the endowment of the university, which is usually followed in the case of leading universities with some sort of billion-dollar number, what does that refer to? What is that endowment that is, in the case of Harvard, I don't know how many tens of billions, right? What does that refer to exactly?
Um, uh, Loosely speaking, it means something like the university's savings, which it invests in the hopes of in the hopes that it appreciates it in value, and the university extracts a certain amount of payout every year in support of operations.
Okay.
In practice, uh, many of the gifts to universities, it will surprise no one to hear that many of the gifts to the universities are in support of specific projects. There are sometimes gifts in support of specific professorship. There are sometimes gifts to establish a center. There are sometimes gifts to build a building. There are sometimes gifts to support a dormitory. They can be gifts to institute a center. Um, so, for some of America's older universities, what we refer to loosely as the endowment is actually often composed literally of thousands. Some universities as much as 5,000, and sometimes, I think in one case, as many as 14,000 separate funds. And they're kept distinct from one another precisely because in many cases, these funds are restricted. The gift specified the use to which it could be put, and the university is in fact not free to spend that money on other things.
Hmm.
This is a, a significant problem both for universities and for how the broader public thinks about the response of universities to pressure at the moment. Because although Harvard has an endowment, yet you're right, circa $50 billion, or Chicago has an endowment circa $10 billion, that money is not simply available like a checking account to be spent in replacement of a diminishment in federal funds. Um,
Yes. Yeah, that is a major problem, I think, in misperception because you can find those numbers easily online and you go up and you say, oh, Harvard has X billion, dollars. And yeah, but that's not money that they can spend for anything. And I think anyone in the audience will appreciate that if they give some money to endow something at a university, a scholarship for a student or whatever, that they would expect the university to honor that commitment and not spend the money on legal fees for whatever else. So let's look at the category of federal and state aid, because in some countries where the state provides like 100% of the revenue or close to it, the state also thereby orders the university in every respect how to carry out its business, right? Its rules and so forth. In fact, even the students that it has to admit each year, and the faculty have no say over that. So, for a long time, I was at a public research university, and we received something like 9% of our revenue from the state of Ohio. This is close to the 8% for Michigan that you mentioned. And as far as I was ever aware, the only strings that were attached to that had to do with serving alcohol at functions. I'm sure there were plenty more, but that's the only thing that ever impinged on our awareness. And federal money also comes with some strings attached. And as far as I knew, this largely had to do with how universities handled things relating to, race or sexual harassment and, following certain protocols that the federal government wanted them to. And this is a very limited, perspective, but I'm saying this to convey the kind of experience that most faculty might have of sort of federal and state restrictions. So, broadly speaking, by what means can either the federal government or the individual states use that part of the revenue that they contribute to tell universities how to do their, either research or just their work in general?
Right. So that's also an excellent question. And you're quite right that the what is worrisome here is or the point on which we need to focus is the connection between the forms of money given to these institutions. Or largely what's at stake at the moment is the connection between forms of money given to institutions and the use of their dependence on that money to control something like speech. Um, so uh, let me say a quick word about what we call academic freedom, and then talk about the forms of control that are kind of traditionally available to both the states and the federal government. Um, and we should remember to come back to states because some of what's happening at the moment, largely under the radar, because it's not as, shall we say, violent as the changes taking place at the federal level. There are a number of bills recently passed at the state level, Florida and Indiana, or looming in the case of Ohio and Texas, that deserve some consideration to anyone worried or concerned about higher education. So broadly speaking, at both the state level and the federal level, the uh, there's been a great respect in writing policy and in the granting of money for what we traditionally call academic freedom, which means something like the freedom of the institution, not the individual faculty member, but the institution to determine its own internal priorities, what research it should fund, what fields or departments it wants to invest in. But it gets down, of course, to the level, since this bears on something like the running of a discipline, it gets down to the level of the appointment of individuals. That there exists something called academic freedom at the level of the institution, which allows institutions of higher education and also institutions of research to operate free from political interference and free from the consideration of issues of prejudice and so on. The decisions that the institutions make are supposed to be based on scientific criteria. And the strength of universities in trying to be dispassionate, disinterested, and so forth, in trying to make rational scientific decisions wherever possible, was recognized in federal policy in 1945 when something like the Modern Research University was created in a set of policies designed under Franklin Roosevelt and really implemented by Harry Truman. When the federal government made the decision, in essence, to invest vast sums and what turned out to be increasing sums in research, and decided, though it was no foregone conclusion, decided that the great bulk of that research money should be directed at universities. It was really the moment when it began. The Modern Research University is a creation of 1945. It did not really exist in the form that we know it before then. And that's also important to remember that it was created in a moment and it can change. Um, but the report that drove this process of investing in universities recognized that university decision-making processes were about as good as we were going to get for directing funds and making personnel decisions and so forth in a way that was well, we're classicists, so I can say sina without ira and studio, to quote Tacitus, without passion or prejudice. And the university, and I'll step aside from universities for one second to say that in the broader context of American federally funded research, the set of processes used at the university of something like disinterested peer review, sometimes even blind peer review, in which the decision makers don't know the identity of the people who are applying to try and remove any possibility of personal influence. This system of so-called peer review that was developed within universities was exported or extrapolated out of the university to be the guiding, to be the major process for the decisions on federal funding from both the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Um, might be useful at some point to come back to this, but I want to stress that federally funded research, the way the NIH and NSF fund research is overwhelmingly through the evaluation of individual projects. The researchers happen to be located at the universities, in many instances, but not all. So the money comes back to the university as the institutional shell where the research is performed. But it's crucial that the money, again, people talk about X billion dollars going to Harvard, but it's been granted by boards of review at the NIH or NSF who are evaluating projects individually on the
Yeah.
basis of the scientific content of the proposal. So that, and let me close by saying that the basic contours and value of academic freedom, of autonomy for the university, of freedom from partisan influence, has been recognized in a whole sequence of appellate and Supreme Court decisions. The contours and limits of it, of course, are subject to exploration, but it's been the subject of continuous discussion in US courts. Now, let me just close by saying there are a variety of ways in which the federal government does have powers it could exercise, bracketing this issue of scientific funding. So, as you mentioned, they can demand compliance with something like civil rights law. And that is the fulcrum that they're using at the moment for a lot of the cuts they're making, is they're accusing universities of not honoring, not protecting students from being able to pursue their education. And the civil rights law protects people for, on the basis of both sex and gender, but also race and religion. Um, they could establish criteria for non-scientific funding schemes that allow certain universities to be in or out of the funding scheme. Um, the federal government has control over unionization processes at private universities. Whereas for the University of Michigan or the University of Oklahoma or the University of Texas, for state universities, it's a state labor relations board that governs it.
Mm.
Private universities are regulated by the federal government's National Labor Relations Board. And of course, they have control over the visa programs that allow both foreign researchers but foreign students to attend or work at private universities.
So in the past, it has occasionally been the case that a particular funded program may have, attained some sort of political notoriety. Maybe there was a Senate hearing, but this is about one particular grant that maybe touched on some sensitive area or was framed in a way that was kind of embarrassing in the press, or whatever. But I don't think there's been any precedent for what's happening now, at least not since, the creation of this framework. Can you tell us what shifted now in the intervention by the federal government into these grants and the allocation of this money? It's very important. What you said is very, very important. And I think that our audience needs to be clear about this. This isn't something like lump sums that the government is giving to university to then decide how it's used. These are very specific research grants that are granted following a peer review process that happens at the foundations or the institutes. Anyway, so what's happened now? What's changed?
Let me just by way of um, um, so let me just say there is one fairly recent precedent that you might say looks something like this. That was a kind of warning sign. Um, uh, no, well, warning sign in a very specific way, but I'll say that there have been several occasions over since, let us say, commencing in Vietnam and beyond is the history that I am aware of. I think it began then, in which uh, universities, or you might say more narrowly, specific voices on campuses uh, resisted um, armed services recruitment or resisted the presence of
Mm,
ROTC programs
right,
on campus. And this has there have been the salience of this as a political issue, as I'm sure you can understand and your audience understands, is right. The salience of this as an issue has gone up and down, frankly, depending on whether we're actually sending soldiers abroad.
right.
Um, uh, but it did come to a kind of a crux for various reasons in the mid 1990s, in part in response not then to warfare, but actually to the implementation of the don't ask, don't tell policy. And um,
Right,
uh,
right.
And the result was a piece of legislation called the Solomon Amendment in 1996, which said more or less if you don't allow ROTC to recruit on campus, you get no federal funds of any kind. And if you were to take away Pell Grants and forbid people to have students, and you were to take away all research grants, the modern research university would cease to exist.
Right.
Um, So I believe the official number was something like 100% of all universities folded within like, like let's say 5 minutes, somewhere between 5 minutes and 24 hours. There's something, and I mention that only because for those who recall the Solomon Amendment and the congressional debate that led up to it, it was a warning that many of the levers of power that the federal government has at its disposal, if it chose to interfere, were fairly crude.
But this was a law.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So let me then say, the other form of right what is perverse about what's going on now, since you asked about now, is um what has been at stake mostly so far, and then I'll gesture at some other areas of concern. What has been at stake mostly so far have been accusations that universities are in one respect or another not honoring the particular this government's interpretation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Um, that in one respect or another, admissions, the implementation of hiring preferences, the direction of scholarships to students with particular racial characteristics, or um, allowing speech on campus that creates a prejudicial environment to the education of specific persons. In this, frequently under this administration, the concern has been about anti-Semitism. Um, now, the the adherence of universities to the specifics of the Civil Rights Act has been an issue of continuous debate, um, almost always related to Title IX, to sex and gender, to the act to issues of access to education on the basis of sex and gender, or prejudicial acts that make it hard for somebody to access education on those grounds. What's noteworthy, what makes the present moment distinctive, um, just about the Civil Rights Act, and then I'll say a quick word more. What makes the present moment distinctive is the Civil Rights Act uh, establishes and enjoins a specific procedure to be followed. There is supposed to be a process by which concerns about civil rights enforcement are brought. Um, uh, uh, an investigation is supposed to be conducted. A report is supposed to be written. Hearings are to be conducted on the basis of that report before a final judgment is issued. And it is specifically stated that whatever punishment or sanction or remedial action is enjoined upon the university, it is supposed to be targeted as narrowly as possible to address the issue that the report found.
Hmm.
And over and over again, the application of, the citation of civil rights violations by the current federal government has been on the basis of no report whatsoever, no hearing, and certainly the cancellation of funding in biomedicine and physics, and for that matter, even the humanities, that has never been demonstrated because never been an investigation that the sanction, to say nothing of remedial action, has anything to do with a specific finding. Um, and that concern is ongoing because more and more, right, the the demands that the federal government has made to Columbia and Harvard. Uh, there's been nowhere in those documents has it stated or explained how the actions it's demanding, this,
Right.
the external supervision of a specific program, the hiring of faculty with specific viewpoints into these, identifiable departments, and so forth. It's never been explained how these relate to the charge that motivated us. So in every respect, we've moved into a kind of a lawless land. I mean, there's a genuflection or a pretextual citation of the Civil Rights Act. But the forms of control that the federal government is seeking seem completely disconnected to that. And there are, and in the case of Harvard, as many of your readers will know, which is the instance that is advanced most thoroughly because Harvard has resisted. Um, the federal government has referred to other powers that it can bring to bear. Um, the refusing to issue visas for foreign students to come to Harvard, even threatening to take away Harvard's tax-exempt status. Um,
Right.
so there are other powers that they could bring to bear, and even threatening to bring those to bear puts us in a very different space or era than we've ever been in before.
And again, these threats also seem to be somewhat um, disconnected from the allegations of wrongdoing on the part of universities. In other words, it just seems like a threat. If you don't do this one thing that we're asking or we want, we're just going to hurt you over here, which underscores the element of, well, you called it lawlessness, but I find like a lack of procedure. Like if I were a university, I would find it very difficult to connect the dots in order to even get
Right.
to where the university wants me to go. And it's just this general climate where due process, as it were. So people are being deported without due process, and it seems the universities are being punished without due process. So,
It may be that I've missed some things here. Um, Uh, but certainly, I have made some attempt to track uh, to follow the trail of documents that's being issued, the letters that go to
Right.
universities and so forth. And just to affirm the point you're making, right? We know that Harvard, Columbia, Penn, Princeton, Cornell, Northwestern, Brown have had these cuts that are specific to universities. We're standing aside in this conversation from the broader culture of the federal government support for research. Um, the it's targeted these specific institutions, and many of those institutions have never received a letter of demand yet. So that the federal government, the Trump
What?
administration, to be specific, it's not, let us say, the federal government is a disinterested party. The Trump administration has has initiated the process of harming the institution and has never told many of them what they need to
Right.
do to get the money back.
Wow.
It's just letting them dangle in the wind.
Okay, so what is the goal here? And I mean the actual goal, not the stated goal, because I don't think we need to spend much time debating the pretense that, that Trump or whatever cares about anti-Semitism. I mean, I think that's just kind of preposterous. What's the actual goal?
Now, there seem to be two things going on. Um, one of which I sort of understand and one I don't. But we haven't talked about the assault that's being made because it's not strictly narrowly about universities, but we haven't talked about the huge cuts that are being made generally to NSF and NIH funding, to the funding for science and basic science, and the enormous harm being done to, or potential harm being done, since some of it has yet been realized, to the funding for biomedical research in the United States. Um, why this government is so interested in cutting back on on basic research in the United States is very, very hard to understand. I don't know of anyone involved in, let us say, the science establishment who, I mean, I take it that there's universal consensus that whatever problem there might be in the occasional panel that awards a grant or whatever,
Right.
that uh, um, um, America's economy, America's extraordinary economy, America's world-beating economy, for the last 80 years had depended crucially, in an absolutely fundamental way, on the federal government's support of the research enterprise. One
Yes.
could list dozens upon dozens upon dozens of absolutely essential discoveries that have been
Yes.
fun. And so on the one, they seem to be intent on destroying that. And in general, quite apart from what I described to as this 1945 compact, in which a symbiotic relationship was set up between federal funding and America's research universities in particular. About universities, my sense is that the current government wishes to assert control over civil society by destroying the autonomy of institutions with any freestanding social authority. They want to bring to heel any institution that they think of as something like having an autonomous voice. And frankly, what they are seeking to destroy are something like the institutional civil society homes of the American left, cultural institutions, educational institutions, museums, art organizations. In this respect, universities are part and parcel of the cuts they've made to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, for the specific board that supported libraries and museums. I mean, universities are, you and I exist at universities, and
Hmm.
we're talking about universities, but I think in thinking about what their aims are, it's important to piece together the larger picture of which the university assault on universities is one part. Um, a lot of what, if you look at the specific demand letters, only a few of which have been issued, as we were
Yeah.
already talking
Yeah.
about, right? What they want is something like control of curriculum, um, broadly speaking, control of speech. Um, if we imagine a larger set of policy, kind of larger policy imagination on the American right at the moment, and then connect the dots between the legislation in Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Texas. Um, they would like to do away with the specific contract protections, so-called tenure, that allow individual academics the particular form of freedom of speech that they possess.
Hmm.
Um, they would like to seize control of the processes by which faculty are appointed. They would like to insist upon what they call intellectual or viewpoint diversity in specific academic programs and broadly. To this end, for example, some of these laws envision mandate the setting up of websites where individual students in individual classrooms can report on the conduct of a class to say that a specific class, that the person wandered off topic and needs to be disciplined. There's an extraordinary range of areas in which they now wish to assert federal or state oversight.
Yeah. I think of this along two lines that sort of converge. On the one hand is the epi- the politics of epistemology. In other words, in recent decades, we've increasingly seen that institutions that produce knowledge have just by default fallen into, the arms of the Democratic Party, and the
Mhm.
Republican Party has become very hostile to them. And by that I mean generation of knowledge in universities, in government, by government bureaus, and also in the media. And the culture war seems to be aligned pretty clearly when it comes to those institutions. So I think that inflicting a certain amount of harm on those institutions just for its own sake has a particular form of delight for people who have been targeting them for years. On the other hand, I think that the sheer arbitrariness of all of this is a way of exercising personal dominance. And this is also how I read the tariffs, by the way. And I've read and seen videos by so many economists who are trying to do all these convoluted rationales for, some long-term economic goal that these tariffs are supposed to accomplish. And I think they're all I mean, they're stretches. In reality, they're just a tool that the president has found in his toolbox that, oh, I can use this to hurt people and make them come to me and kiss the ring or ask for exemptions or whatever, whatever. No matter the damage. Like, I think that's secondary. I think it's a form of personal dominance. But anyway, we can talk about this obviously for a long time. I wanted to come back to what you said just a moment ago, which is the specific kinds of damage that these funding cuts are inflicting on American universities. Like, how has this impacted the research mission?
Um, Let me just say quickly in response to what you said, um, uh, that I don't think I think we have to be careful that um, uh, the critics of American research universities, the critics are numerous, and that they don't all have the same objectives.
Mm,
Just to name one important possible outcome of what's going on. Um, um, sure, there are people who are interested in smashing the system, in paring it down and seeing what happens without very much regard for the forms of harm they're doing. And I'm aware we have to come back to harm. But I think there are others um, who, for example, like there would be some who would say, why not smash the private Ivy League? Among other things, none of them exist in my state. Um, and the current system of awarding federal research money, which is to individual projects, not universities, right? Uh, but that process has led to a very asymmetrical distribution of research money. There are institutions that get a lot of it, and
mm,
states that get a lot of it, and states that get less. Um, and one proposal that's on the table in the kind of wider world of higher education at the moment would be to move to end this system of federal peer review of individual applications and move to a block grant system. Um, that is block grant decided in various ways, but one possibility would be block grant state by state.
Mm,
Um, that would be a big change. It would probably do various kinds of harm. It's hard to predict that future. But all I will say is that the current system has done extraordinarily well. We all recognize the merit of having experts evaluate individual proposals. There are scientific benefits to the aggregation of large scientists, of many scientists in a specific place, for better or worse. And I will certainly say that if we were to move to a block grant system, if there were to be federal legislation to move to a block grant system, there would be no going back. You would never get a whole body of senators to agree to send money away from their own states and
mm,
back to concentrated groups of scientists.
right,
So if that, as I say, it's hard to predict what that change would mean. You can make guesses, but that, I wouldn't, I hesitate to say, I totally endorse your claim about something like dominance. You might even say also kind of an erotic fascination with destruction for its own sake on the part of select individuals, but that does not, those individuals don't encompass, that's not the totality of the kind of opposition to universities at this
right,
moment.
right, of course.
The about harm, I guess there are two ways to think about it. One would be to say that there are, or three. One, there are specific projects which have just been terminated. And if you, many of these multi-year projects, there are certain kinds of projects where you could build them up again. You could actually hit pause in certain kinds of humanities projects, and you might be able to revive them again, although people move on. There are scientific projects that, frankly, you're never going to recover. An
Right.
interruption in literally the physical process would mean you have to restart ab initio, and that could turn out to be impossible. Um, uh, and there's a cost that you might say is human if you're the kind of ethical person who believes in humans and their careers. And or if you're a kind of a different kind of thinker, you could say there's a cost at the level of human capital.
Yeah.
Um, that if we, there are many people associated with universities whose salary depends upon these specific grants for specific projects, and their careers will be interrupted, perhaps permanently interrupted, if these projects are not funded. And one of the rationales for running scientific research through universities is that it is early career scientists, often students engaging in doctoral training, who constitute, let us say, a significant percentage of the labor force of American research,
Right.
so that they cut their teeth as students on the leading research of the day. And that is part of what makes them available and qualified to be the next generation of the best researchers. In this sense, one of the reasons why America's universities have frankly, or why the system as a whole, the broader ecology of American higher education is so dominated, um, uh, both research and education, is because the success in the two areas feed off each other.
Mm-hmm.
We produce by far the world's largest number of leading doctoral students, and then they stay here. And the one country in the world that has looked at our system and decided to invest in something that looks structurally similar with similar levels of funding is China. One of the fascinating things about and China's success in the China's success China has been wonderfully successful in imitating America. The Chinese something like basic science and applied science research enterprise is actually astonishing. Um, uh, by comparison, there's been a limited amount of press given to endeavors, particularly in Germany and France at the national level, but a broader effort by the ERC to attract scientists to come to Europe because they're observing the hostility of the United States to the sudden and the surprising hostility of the United States to the research enterprise and are seeking to attract scientists. But if you look at the scale of the money that the ERC just announced as a new block grant available to the ERC to whatever. It was on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And similar and the amount being made available by France specifically was less than that, and by Germany was a little bit less than that. But the budget for funding science in the NIH and NSF runs to tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
The This is just a case where if Europe really wanted to reimagine itself, it needs not simply to understand what the United States did to create this extraordinary culture. It needs to be willing to commit the resources to replicate it. And there, as you say, for all that there are many universities in Europe, they have very very few. I mean, the extraordinary thing about the United States is not the wonders of its leading research universities, but the sheer diversity, the excellence of America's top universities across the board is replicated nowhere else in the world except perhaps now China.
Right. And scientific research and science is international, and its truths are applicable everywhere. So, I I welcome Chinese science.
Yeah.
Um, um, what's extraordinary to me is the the 10 years of austerity at the public university I was at that I witnessed, um, all seem to have this underlying message that, nah, we don't want the humanities, we want STEM. It's all about STEM, 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 STEM. And then suddenly it's this weird shift to like the areas being primarily impacted right now. Now, downstream, this will have consequences for everybody.
Right.
And I don't think that we in the humanities are going to be insulated from this at all. But we just require much, much, much less. We're nothing. We're peanuts, right? But the attack on the sciences is extraordinary, given the results that it has produced over decades, and so many technologies and breakthroughs that everyone in the audience has benefited from at one point or another are at some point can be traced back to some kind of research that took place in American university. Okay, so here's the important question, and we'll have to end with this.
Mhm.
How have American universities responded to this assault right now, and how do you think they should respond?
Um, so far, um, the responses have been, well, something like of two kinds. Um, um, where the assault is on the university specifically. And I say of two kinds mostly because there's really only two universities that clearly understand what they're being asked to do.
Okay.
All right. The first case is Columbia, which assented to many of the demands, the great bulk of the demands being made of it by the Trump administration. This included changing policies having to do with student protests. It had to do with the supervision of a specific academic program. It had to do with something like the appointment of additional faculty in specific departments to increase their, as I say, viewpoint diversity. And there were other things. But Columbia largely assented. Now, one of the things that was obvious on paper, but I'm not sure Columbia took quite seriously, is that the initial demand letter to Columbia said that instituting all of these changes was simply a precondition to further negotiations. They did not promise to restore the $400 million.
Hmm.
And then the next thing that apparently arose was the possibility that the Trump administration would invite Columbia to that it would force Columbia to sign a consent decree, which is a kind of legal instrument that imposes a federal judge as final arbiter of whether Columbia is adhering to the terms of this. Um, and as this set of negotiations was unfolding, Colombia switched its posture, also switched its president. And the new president of Colombia, who was not an academic, who was a member of the board of trustees, announced that Colombia would not accept any would not accede to any further demands that compromised its academic freedom. By contrast, uh, as if it was sort of drunk on power, the initial set of demands to Harvard went much further than the demands to Columbia, and Harvard simply refused to negotiate at all. Um, and there was much confusing press about this because the federal government was sort of actually seems to have been surprised. Um, and tried to claw back to an earlier stage of negotiation by insisting, most remarkably, that the letter it had sent to Harvard was sent in error and it was the wrong draft.
Mm.
But the basically what is the two paths people have followed so far are something like accession, conceding to demands as much as possible in order to preserve itself, and in Harvard's case, refusal. Um, uh, so that's where we stand. If only because most of the other universities that have been targeted have not had the opportunity to respond. There is this other world in which the federal government is cutting specific programs even after awards have been made. Um,
Right.
and in many of those cases, I should say, we haven't discussed it, but universities are pursuing the path of litigation. Although, in some instances, for example, the National Endowment for the Humanities, universities exist in an ecology with non-university institutions, like say, the American Historical Association, which is a disciplinary organization, not a university, obviously. And in some cases, the universities seem to be relying either on the resources of others or allowing other people to stick their head above the parapet, because the main lawsuit about the cutting of the funds of the National Endowment of Humanities is being led by learned societies and not by the universities themselves. But
Mm.
universities have engaged in a substantial amount of litigation about the termination of grants or the imposition of new terms of grants post-award for NIH and NSF. And there are non-university groups that are suing on First Amendment grounds about the termination of DEI programs. So there's a lot of litigation.
Right.
There's a lot of litigation in the background, but universities have also had the opportunity publicly to concede or publicly to resist. And so far, we have an example of one and an example of the other.
Well, you've written pretty eloquently about what you think universities should do at this crisis moment, more preemptively. Can you
Sure.
give us yeah.
Uh, my my own feeling is that the sector needs to stand up and resist um, the Trump administration very broadly. And it needs to do so on the grounds that of all, it needs to recognize itself as a sector that something like um, American higher education and specifically American research universities exist in an ecology of mutual dependence. It may be of interest to Senator A or Senator B to smash the Ivy League and redirect funds to his institution. It's actually not in the interests of the broader ecology of American higher education to allow that to happen.
Mm.
Um, uh, Among other things, because the attack over, say, anti-Semitism or the attack on research funding is the thin edge of the wedge. We know on the basis of all of
Right.
the state legislation
Yeah, yeah.
where this is going. And it's not simply about the enforcement of civil right protections for students. Um, and more broadly, I think, as I've said, that the attack on universities is part of an assault on civil society more generally. One way to measure that civil society would be to say that, you know, it would not surprise me if, the if one of the categories of institution you might say is in the crosshairs of this administration, it's not just educational institutions, but frankly, the nonprofit ecology as a whole. Either the world of nonprofits, which is about 3.3 trillion in size, with about 8 trillion in assets, or even the narrow ecology of 501(c)(3)s. That this all of these organizations that are tax exempt because they contribute something like they contribute in a nonprofit way to education, to arts, and so on is in the eyes of this administration. And I would like universities to realize One, that their self-interest can be preserved by helping to preserve that um, uh, that the universities can flourish only in a context of a robust civil society, and that they are uniquely organized as institutions. They're uniquely empowered by the specific capacities of people who work at these institutions to defend civil society. And I'd like to think that if universities stood forward and declared their values, insisting not simply that universities stand for academic freedom, which is not a great rallying cry,
Mm,
and not simply that universities are in favor of indirect cost recovery, not a great rallying cry, but universities are frankly in favor of um, freedom itself, that the universities could serve as a focal point for a major political turn in the fortunes of the country at this moment.
yeah, to a certain degree, American universities understand their relationship with each other to be competitive, obviously, and this has some beneficial consequences, but there's a deeper sense in which we're admitting each other as students, we're hiring each other as graduates, we're all operating within this same kind of model, and there's a point at which I agree with you. The sector has to come together like more officially and overtly and stand for something that would actually also improve its standing in the eyes of the rest of society. And while one of the worst things that this administration has done is make me root for Harvard, um, I am willing to do it. But I agree with you. I would like to see universities be more vocal and be seen in that fight. Um, anyway,
But
yeah,
it would, there is no doubt, but that in the short term, the power lies in the hands of the federal government,
yeah,
particularly a federal government that is prepared. I mean, it's assaults on universities on the basis of civil rights law are bound to fail because the procedure that they're supposed to follow is clear. But they can do enormous harm
yeah,
and have enormous leverage because they are prepared to do the harm and take the money away
right,
and wait for the litigation to solve the problem later. But in the meantime, the control they've exercised is profound. I don't think anyone thought, in the sphere of higher education, the phrase that the word that's often used is compact. This agreement, this compact, in which the federal government directed extraordinary resources to America's universities to do research on behalf of the American public. Um, and the entire configuration of universities and their labs and their scientists and their doctoral education has grown out of that. You know, American universities pre-1940 would be unrecognizable to
yeah,
most of us today.
yeah,
Um, I don't think anyone thought in 1945 that the world we were creating was one that would turn out to be a source of, instead of great benefit, would also turn out to be a source of just extraordinary vulnerability
yeah.
to America's great institutions of higher education. But that is the world we are in now.
Cliff, thank you so much for coming on to explain all of this. A lot of this world is opaque to many people, even within universities. And also, thank you for all the writing that you've been doing, which has taken you away from, uh, you know, writing about the Roman Empire, which we will get to, I promise, in a later episode. So, thank you again.
Yep. Thank you, Anthony.